Edmonton, and I think it was a bit too long since I've been able to get to this part of Canada, so it's a wonderful thing. Thank you, Father, for your warm words of welcome, and I'm looking forward to our time today. I know that it's hard to hold your questions until the end, but the reason for that is that usually I end up answering a lot of the questions in the course of the day. So I don't want to be saying, well, we'll talk about that later, repeat it. So let's go ahead and get started. And as Father said, we're going to be taking a break about every hour. So you'll hopefully get plenty of time to stand up and stretch and get something to ear whistle. Well, you live in the north. Let's say you were headed home. After a brief visit to a neighboring town, your life is ordinary by society's standards, nothing exceptional or unusual about it. But everything changes one day because of a chance encounter with a strange little man. He's short and bald, covered in scars. His skin is weathered by exposure to the elements. And just like you, in the eyes of most people, there's nothing particularly to distinguish him by his appearance. There's no air of refinement or education, no hint of status. His clothes and sandals are worn, his hands are rough from years of manual labor. But when he speaks to you, his face fills with an intensity of passion and purpose that is utterly captivating. There's something indefinable, and what he says is so extraordinary that if it's true, it's life-changing. His traveling companion calls him Saul, but after your initial conversation, he introduces himself as Pavlos of Tarsus. It so happens that you're bound for the same destination. You're not in North America, you're in northern Greece. And you're bound for Philippi. And as you walk several kilometers together, by the time you arrive in Philippi, you are hooked. And as bizarre as his message seems to you and maybe to others, there's something deep inside that resonates with you. And to the depth of your being, you know that it's true. And you have to know more about this amazing man, Jesus. Later people would call him Jesus of Nazareth. So you join Lydia and a small group of people who form a tight-knit community in Philippi, the first church in Europe. Paul is your teacher, your guide, your father in this new faith. Every day you gather with the others to learn more about this compelling but strange faith. What is your connection to this faith? How do you learn anything? What's your source of information? A book? A New Testament? An internet site? Whatever you kind of pick up from the culture? Of course, none of these things. There's only one source of information, and that's an apostle. And the method by which you learn is oral teaching. Every day you learn more, and everything you know about the life and teachings of Jesus Christ and what that means in your life comes from one source, an apostle. Now later you'll probably meet other apostles as well. What I'm trying to get across here by trying to help you visualize life in the primitive church was that St. Paul didn't just teach people facts about Jesus and maybe baptize them and then send them off into the world. These first believers joined a community, the church, and it had a very specific way of life that was quite different from everything they had ever known. And everything else in the world was quite different. Everyone else in the world was either a pagan, which meant that they sacrificed animals and had a usually immoral lifestyle and they worshipped idols, or maybe they were Jews, in which they also sacrificed animals and adhered to rules of strict ritual purity that was extremely restrictive and confined daily life. This new group that you joined is nothing like either of those. It's neither Jewish nor pagan. How are you supposed to live? What are the parameters of your life? What guides you? So the first Christians were taught by the apostles. The apostles had been taught by the Lord. This is what we mean by apostolic tradition. This is the foundation of the church. This is what all believers learned and believed and preserved. Why did they preserve it? Why did they hold on to it so tightly? Because that was everything. They had no pamphlets, no handouts, no books, no videos, no Bible, no canons, no YouTube. They didn't even have church fathers to consult, right? They listened to the apostles. They trusted the apostles, and they clung to what they were taught as they sat and listened to oral instruction. This was the essential element of the early church, the teaching of the apostles. And they had, the first Christians had confidence in the apostles and what they were taught, and that's what they passed on to us, and that's what we call tradition. So St. Paul and the other apostles did not teach simply facts, as I said, or tell stories about Jesus, but what they brought to these people was a whole way of life. And the example that they followed were those very apostles who taught them, wherever that little community happened to be, whether it was India with Thomas, or whether it was in Rome, or whether it was in Alexandria. Their model was that apostle. He was the one who knew Christ. He was the one who lived with Christ. He was the one whom they imitated. So this is why St. Paul says to them, what you see and hear in me, do. This is why St. Paul says, imitate me. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. So we have to get back to this basic understanding that how we live our lives on a daily basis really matters. Not because we're saved by doing specific things, like our rule of prayer and all these other things that we have a list in our mind, but because the things that we do are supposed to shape us mentally. They're supposed to change us. They're supposed to transform us. They're supposed to create within us a certain attitude toward the world. And we call this attitude or this mentality in the church, Phronema. Our life in Christ is not a set of facts to which we intellectually assent, okay, even for the Orthodox Church. So some people come to the Orthodox Church because they recognize that there's something else out there. There's something missing in whatever they've been taught so far. So they find it in Orthodoxy intellectually. They say, yes, this is correct, this is true, I can sign on to this. But to become an Orthodox Christian, it is much, much more than that, simply changing one set of beliefs for another. There are also things that must be done, there are actions to be performed, but even that is not enough. We have to do them with the right attitude. We have to have the right way of life. We have to have the right frame of mind. That's what Phronema is all about. That's why it's so difficult to explain. So, how would you describe orthodoxy? Now, you may already be in a situation where you've had to try to somehow explain orthodoxy to people who say, why are you joining this weird group? You know, they have these icons and this funny singing, and the priest always wearing this long black dress and all this other stuff that they say. How do you describe orthodoxy? We are neither Protestant nor Catholic. We do have certain characteristics of each of those, but what makes us different is not what we believe, or even necessarily the things we do, but why we do them, and why we believe these things. And this is a result of our Phronema, and that's what's hard to explain. Why do you do this? What do you believe? Well, orthodoxy cannot be reduced to explaining our beliefs. What we need to try to do, if we are to try to successfully convey orthodoxy to others is try to help them understand that there's a different manner of thought in the Orthodox Church. That is the key to being an Orthodox Christian. Everyone has a phronema, and there are a lot of ways that that word has been translated. Mind, mentality, stance, worldview, an attitude toward life. Everybody has something that sort of guides them. And we have an Orthodox phronema, and this is what makes us different. So later we're going to talk about how to acquire an Orthodox phronema and why we have the phronema that we have. So don't be intimidated. It's a foreign word, I understand that, but it's just 3 syllables. Phronema. Okay, why don't you say it with me so we get it out of the way? Phronema. Yeah, phronema. So easy, right? And by the way, you know dozens of Greek words, okay? Not just from church, but they're part of English language. So don't be intimidated just because you see a Greek word. So why don't we just use the word mind for phronema? Why do I keep talking about phronema? Because, as is the case with so many theological words, no one English word really captures adequately the meaning of that word. Because it's not really just mind, and by the way, we have another name for a word for mind, which is nous, which has a different meaning than phronema. You see, the Greek language has a huge vocabulary, much, much, much greater than Hebrew, and even bigger than English. So it has a big vocabulary and lots of different words with a very specific nuance. Phronema is not just mental process. It's not just about wisdom. That's the word Sophia. Sophia is purely intellectual. But phronema, from ancient Greek times, meant thought plus action. That's why it's your way of life, you see. It's the right attitude. So phronema is the reason why we are Orthodox. And this is what is the Orthodox characteristic, our specific phronema. And it's so impossible to define. And this is why it's, unfortunately, it's the dominant sort of aspect of Orthodoxy, but at the heart of it is this absolute faithfulness to apostolic tradition. Well, phronema is a biblical word too. It's found in the Old Testament primarily in Proverbs. And when you think about it, that makes perfect sense because Proverbs is all about instructions for daily life. Now, here, you're not going to be able to recognize most of the time when the word behind the particular proverb is actually the word phronema. You're not going to know it because it's translated in a lot of different ways, like understanding or prudence or discernment, gain understanding, seek discernment, things like this. There are many proverbs that use this word. But the whole point of Proverbs is learning a godly way of life and marrying that to your thought process. In the New Testament, the word phronema is used only once, but it's a very dramatic moment. This is when the Lord, St. Peter goes to the Lord because the Lord has foretold his passion to the disciples. And Peter goes to him later and says, we can't let you go to Jerusalem. We can't let you be crucified. And Jesus says, what? Get thee behind me, Satan. Nobody can forget that line, but that's not where the phronema comes in. He says to Peter, you are thinking the way men think, not the way God thinks. And the word that is used there is that word phronema. It's your mentality. Your mentality is the problem. You see, you're thinking like people think. Now, St. Paul is the one who used the word phronema more than anybody else in the New Testament. And he wrote about attitude and behavior and faith, what to believe. And we saw that even in the little excerpt that was read today in our worship service that we just had in the little Philippians, because he uses the word Philippians a lot. He uses the word in Philippians a lot. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, see, they were following what he said, so now, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Well, what does that mean? How did they know what that means? How did they know what to do? They learned it from him. remember that the epistles of St. Paul were written usually to address problems in a community. They're not they cannot be the sole instruction manual, because they presume that the people to whom Paul is writing have already been catechized. They already know what to believe. They already know what to do. And it's all those things that were not written down because they weren't a problem, they weren't an issue that he's talking about here, okay? So notice how he tells them how to live. Do everything without grumbling or questioning, be blameless and innocent, etc. So this is, actually in Philippians, we have a lot of use of the word phronema because St. Paul was very concerned about the attitude of the Christians in the communities he established. So it's not enough just to know what to believe, but how to behave. So in Romans, we may have perhaps one of the most dramatic uses of this word. And by the way, phronema, that, mind or attitude or mentality, that's a noun, but this word also has a verb form, right? So the verb form is phroneo. So that's how it was used in the Gospels with Jesus, when Jesus spoke to Peter. So here's the verb form in Romans chapter 8. For those who are according to the flesh have their minds on the things of the flesh. That have their minds on is one word, phronousi. Okay? So it's not have their minds on, 4 words, it's one word. They're thinking. They have the mentality of the flesh. But those who are according to the Spirit, on the things of the Spirit. For the mindset, phronema, of the flesh is death. But the mindset, phronema, of the Spirit is life and peace. For the mindset, again, phronema, of the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit itself to God's law because it cannot. Look at that. If you are of the flesh, you cannot submit to God's law. Okay? It's impossible. And you don't even have the mind to know that you need to do this, to submit to God's law. So St. Paul uses the word phronema there in other places in Romans. But he also uses it in Philippians at least 9 times, and that's a pretty short letter. Now, contrary to what is usually the case with the epistles of St. Paul, where he's addressing problems or issues, in the case of the Philippians, he is not doing that. In the case of the Philippians, they sent him money while he was in prison, and he wanted to thank them for their help. It was unsolicited. This little community was very close to St. Paul and tremendous supporters of St. Paul. So he emphasizes to them the importance of the right attitude, and this is what will help us have the correct behavior. And much of it focused on and centered on unity and humility. So he says, complete my joy, being of the same mind. All of that, being of the same mind. 5 words. It's one word in Greek. Phronite, having the same love, being in full accord, and of one mind there again. Phronundes. So look at how he talks about the unity of the faith, the unity of thought, and how important this is. And he says this is what's going to make his joy complete. And this is one of the most striking epistles because he's in prison and yet it's so full of joy. One of the characteristics of this epistle is how joyful St. Paul is. And he says, this is all I really want, is that you be united of mind and have this type of mind. And then he writes down one of the most important passages in the New Testament. After he pushes them to have this specific Christian phronema, to have this type of mentality, he gives them the ultimate example of that. And he says again, have this in mind, phronita, among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. You already have this mind. It is yours in Christ Jesus. Who? And then he begins to give us what is called the Philippian hymn. Who, although he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. And he goes on to talk about the extreme humility of Christ, to go from life with the Father to agree to be incarnate, to agree to death, and even a death on the cross, right? So that afterwards, of course, he was exalted to be at the right hand of the Father. This is the introduction, this idea of having the right mind is the introduction to that extraordinary theological statement. So look at how important that is. And this is key to Orthodox Christian life, because this was the key to the lifestyle of the first Christians. So in Romans, he says the same kind of thing. And again, using the word of Phronema. For I say, through the grace given to me, to all who are among you, that each one not be high-minded. This is in Romans 12. Hyper-phronin, hyper-phronin, that's hyper is above, right? Don't be high-minded, don't think of yourselves better than others, concerning himself, more than he ought to think, but to think, phronin, in the right manner, sophronin, according to the measure of faith that God has appointed to each. So here again, he's talking about the importance of having the right attitude, the right kind of mentality. And he used phronema again in Romans to promote unity of thought. May the God of patience and consolation, this is in chapter 15 of Romans, grant you to have the same mindset, phronin, among one another in Christ Jesus. Now, what does this have to do with the way that we live our ordinary, everyday life? Well, prior to the start of Lent, we all get ready for Lent, right? We know we're going to have to start fasting, we're going to have to change our lifestyle during Lent, and one of the things that is characteristic of Lent is the fast, right? So we read from St. Paul's epistle prior to the beginning of the fast, and he uses this same word, phronema, in Romans 14 to talk about the proper attitude toward eating food or abstaining from it. Now, to be perfectly clear, he's not talking about fasting the way we do it. He's talking about probably eating food that had been offered to idols, or possibly keeping the Jewish law. Some people in the community were keeping the laws of dietary regulations, and others were not. That was probably the case. But nonetheless, it applies to us as well when we're thinking about spiritual practices such as fasting. So in Romans 14:6, he says, after telling us not to judge other people for what they're eating, for food will not commend us to God, right? He says, for the one regards, and that's the word phronon. Now here's the word regards. In other words, thinks about or considers the day. The one who regards the day regards it phroni, for the Lord. You remember that passage? So he who eats for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And the one who does not eat for the Lord, and he gives thanks to God. So look at that. Isn't that the most amazing thing? He doesn't say, listen, you guys, that's how you're supposed to live. Eat this or don't eat that. He says the important thing is the attitude. So this is what I'm hoping we will try to explore today together, because we have in the Orthodox Church a tendency to want to create rules, to insist upon certain strict manner of life, and I'm not saying we don't do these things, but what I'm trying to challenge you to think about is that it is extremely important how we do those things, not the technical rules of fasting, reading the label to see if there's any milk in the thing, but the attitude with which we approach it, the attitude that we have about our own fasting, and God forbid about other people's fasting. We're not supposed to have an opinion about their fasting. And that's very hard to do, okay? Because once you are engaged in the spiritual life, there is an easy tendency to start judging others who are not living up to what you think the standard should be. All right? So this is, look at what he's saying. It almost, for Paul, he said, it doesn't matter. And the fact is, and the truth is, that fasting is not essential to our salvation. It's not in the creed. Okay, so don't go out and say, oh, Presbyterian Jeannie said, we don't have to fast. I'm not saying that, okay? I'm saying we have to recognize the place it has in the life of the church. So it's obviously, it's very important, and it is something that we do, but we don't do it to do it. We don't do it because we think it's going to save us. We don't do it to get points to get into heaven. And if we are doing it for those reasons, it is of absolutely no use. Okay? So we need to get beyond the kind of rules. What do I need to do to be saved? Do this, 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 this. I have checked all the boxes. Therefore, I have stamped my ticket into the kingdom of heaven. St. Paul is saying that the attitude is very important. So, the first Christians have this very distinct phronema. They were taught about Christ by the apostles in the same way that the apostles learned about Christ. So think about this. The apostles lived with Christ for 3 years. Every day, every day, every day. And they watched him and they listened to him. He taught them separately. We don't even know what he said to them. Think about that. That's not written down anywhere. And then they listened to him teaching the crowds. And then they watched him time after time after time as people came to him for healing or with their problems, as they came to him with questions, maybe sincere questions, maybe challenging questions. They watched him intently and they absorbed his phronema. That's what he was doing there. He was shaping them to have a specific way of thinking that was tied to a way of behaving. That's what they got from the Lord. He didn't write anything down. He gave the apostles a phronema. So when they went out to establish the church in the four corners of the ecumeny, of the civilized world, that's what they gave the people. What are they going to give the people? I'm going to give you a copy of the words of Jesus. This is what he said, and this is what he gave us. So, no, they gave the people, of course, they taught the people about Jesus Christ, but it was more than that. There was a whole attitude, there was an orientation to the world and life that was different from everybody else. It was distinct. And the first Christians learned this from the apostles, who learned this from the Lord. And day after day, their phronema was shaped. And this happened with the apostles, first with the Lord, and then also for the first Christians. So we see this in the Gospels. We see this like when the Samaritans, when they're passing through Samaria, and this is in the Gospel of Luke, and the Samaritans start throwing stones at Christ and the disciples because they're Jewish. James and John saying, shall we call down fire from heaven to destroy them? Jesus, it says, rebuked them, So we see in the disciples the, insecurities, the fears, this kind of attitude. Lord, we want you to give us whatever we ask. Well, what is it you ask? And we sit on your right hand and your left hand. So we see that their phronema was not fully shaped. There were times of tremendous insight, and then there were times of, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do with you. Perverse and sinful generation. You know what I mean? So they were part of a process. Let's remember that too. It didn't happen overnight with the apostles. Let's not be impatient. Let's understand that there was a gradual process, year by year by year, moment by moment, by which the apostles themselves absorbed this phronema of the Lord. And then, as they established communities and they stayed with these people and they saw them every day and they spoke endlessly about the Lord and what is expected in the Christian life, again, The Phronema of these first Christians was shaped gradually so that they no longer behaved or thought like the rest of the world around them. They were so different, not only in what they believed, but how they behaved, that people noticed that. How did the church grow in those first centuries when they were being persecuted? How did the church grow? Think about that. Well, people were impressed by those first Christians. What impressed them? That they went to their deaths cheerfully. And that was one of the things that was very shocking, because they were all dragged into the arena. Not all of them. Sometimes they were dragged into the arenas, or they were told, they were challenged to deny Christ, and they never did. They went to their death bravely and cheerfully, especially when they saw women and children martyrs. And the second thing that was very striking to the pagans was their love of neighbor. So the first Christians did not necessarily stand on the street corner and try to convince people through rational arguments that Jesus is the Messiah or the Son of God. They just lived their lives. And through that, people took notice of them. That's what we're missing today. People noticed this love of neighbor, love of enemies, that when they were being martyred, they were praying for their enemies. Nobody did that. Who does that? Only crazy people. Well, that's what the Romans said. These people are crazy. They literally believed that they were insane because they worshipped a crucified criminal. And families who had a member who became a Christian, they were beside themselves, and they said, oh, this is a terrible superstition. This is perverse. And they practiced cannibalism, we hear, and incest. They're evil because they call each other brother and sister. Husbands and wives would even call each other brother and sister. So that was so different from the rest of the world. The consistent behaviors drew the attention of people. So this is what formed the church in the beginning. So in that sense, Phronema is like tradition. It's the unwritten foundation of everything in the church. So now I'll ask you a question. Which church seems to have been St. Paul's most difficult community? That's right. And why? What were they doing? What were they doing? Well, that's a long list of things, right? What's the first thing he criticizes them for doing? What's the first thing? What? The first thing. Oh, getting drunk. They did do that, but that's not the first thing. In chapter 1. Yeah, disunity. They were quarreling. Isn't that shocking? Can you believe that the Greeks were arguing? I can hardly believe that. That's what they say. That's what they were arguing. What can we say? I mean, it's shocking, but it's in the Bible, so it must be true. We have no experience with it, right? So, now think about that. That, of course, is one of the most powerful passages in the entire New Testament is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where he speaks about the cross, right? Now, they were very proud of their wisdom, right? He says, what is this I'm hearing from Chloe's people? Chloe's people ratted them out. They wrote to St. Paul with questions. He's in Ephesus. They wrote from Corinth. They sent the letter to Ephesus with questions, and he says, okay, I'll get to your questions. He doesn't get to the questions until chapter 7. Chapters 1 to 6 are all their problems that they didn't tell him about. It's like going to confession and not saying what you really need to say, okay? You've got to do that. You have to come clean about everything. So they didn't talk about that. Why not? Because they didn't think they were doing anything wrong. I am for Paul, I'm for Apollos, I'm for Cephas, I'm for Christ. Was Paul crucified? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? So Paul was glad that obviously other people were doing most of the baptizing, because he was worried that they had created a kind of cult around personalities. So they were arguing, and yet they were very proud of their wisdom. They identified these different apostles with a specific kind of wisdom, much like people sort of have favorite ball teams or political parties or things like this. And He said, you think you're so wise, but you have this man living this immoral lifestyle among you, and you think you're so wise, but you're suing each other in court. My goodness, they were full of all kinds of problems. But one of the things that he says is, you're very proud of yourselves. You're so wise, but really you're like little babies. You're so immature, and partly it was because of this. It was because they were quarreling that he said, you are still of the flesh. And this is why I could only give you milk. They thought that they were already had reached this kind of exalted spiritual state, but it wasn't the truth. He could only give them milk. Why? Because of their attitude, because of their phronema, because of their behavior, their quarreling, their rivalries, their pride. They were still of the flesh. They were not prepared to understand spiritual things, not because they were less intelligent, not because they were lacking knowledge, but because they did not have the right phronema. One of the little sayings that St. Paul says in Corinthians is, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And that's the difference between intellectual understanding of the faith and living the faith in the right kind of way. Knowledge puffs up, so they were very puffy. And it is the word literally to be puffed up. Fusco, like we even have the word modern Greek, fusco mene, puffed up. You can tell when somebody's puffed up with himself. So knowledge puffs up. That's what they were. They were very puffy, those Corinthians. But they lacked love. That's why all of 1 Corinthians 1 to 12 is leading to that chapter on love in 13. Okay? But it's not about romantic love. It's about Christian love, the love we're supposed to have with the right attitude. So after explaining how they actually were little babies, not these people with superior intellect and knowledge and wisdom. And he says, he gets a little bit sarcastic with them. He says, already you are filled, already you've become kings, but us poor apostles, we're just being kicked around. We've become the garbage of the world. You've got everything, you know everything, and we're just garbage. The offscouring of all things, right? So powerful. But he says, but we, apostles, have the mind of what? Christ. Yes. Okay. Now there, I wish there was the word phronema, but it's not. It's the word nous. Okay? But the point is, you understand what he's getting at. This is how we are living. We're living lives that we're being kicked around, we're buffeted, when we're reviled, we, bless, when persecuted, we conciliate, we endure all things, and we're living this kind of life, but we have the mind of Christ. And so what they're pursuing is nothing like what the Corinthians are pursuing. And this is what it means to have the mind of Christ. They have a spiritual understanding. So the question now is, what kind of mind do we have? Do we have the mind of Christ? Or do we have the mind of the world? So elsewhere in Romans, St. Paul says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And there again, it is the word nous. So this word nous is rather important in Orthodox theology. You've probably heard about it. So I'll go ahead and talk about it, at least very briefly, because people always ask me about this. So what is the nous? And this, again, is one of those indefinable aspects of Orthodoxy. You'll read some fathers talk about it. Obviously, there are books that talk about what is the nous. But I'll just talk about this so we can kind of get it out of the way. According to the Holy Fathers, the nous is that aspect of the human person that was created by God specifically to have a relationship with Him. In other words, we were made to be in relationship with God. Now, it is translated in many different ways. Sometimes the word nous is translated as intellect. but it's not the ordinary Greek word for intellect. And it was not talking about your intellectual process. Sometimes it's translated as mind, but it's not exactly the mind. Sometimes it's translated as spiritual. Sometimes they just leave it as nous, or they'll say the noetic. Okay, they'll use an adjective, the noetic this or the noetic that. But the nous is the part of the person that was created by God to know God, to interact with God. And the purpose of our spiritual life is to elevate that way of thinking, to purify, to illuminate that part of us. And that's where baptism comes in. When we are baptized, we are illuminated. And that's the ancient Christian word for baptism, right? Holy illumination. So when St. Paul baptized those first Christians, he baptized them into the church, and they were illuminated. And he uses that term also. So when he talks about their illumination. So they are now children of light, he says, not children of the darkness. This means that they have everything that they need to have a specific kind of life. But they themselves have to actualize that. So the nous of the human person was, we were created perfect. That was darkened by sin. So our nous is darkened by sin. And it is illuminated at baptism. We have everything that we need to go on in our spiritual life, to have a relationship with God. So we, Orthodox, emphasize relationship with God in a way that's different than others. Obviously, I'm going to be making broad, sweeping generalizations today, which is always dangerous, but we kind of have to when we're talking about big concepts, all right? So I'm going to be talking about other kinds of Christians, and I'm not, I hope you don't think I'm being disrespectful, but I have to explain Orthodoxy in contrast to other, church Christian traditions, okay, to Catholic tradition, the Protestant tradition. Otherwise, it's difficult for you to understand. We can't understand ourselves in a vacuum, but usually in comparison to something else. So, obviously Christians seek a relationship with Christ. The difference for the Orthodox is that we understand that what we're trying to do, or we should understand we're trying to do, is to illuminate the mind. That means we have to think differently. And this is where Phronema comes in. So it's not simply about this intellectual exercise. We have to learn more about Jesus. You see, the Corinthians weren't lacking in knowledge. You see, it was their attitude that was the problem. So it's not that we need to learn more about Jesus or study the Bible more, memorize more Bible verses. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Those are good things. But if we do only that and we don't do anything else, that doesn't help to illuminate the nous. So it's illuminated by prayer, by ascetic exercises. Again, not those exercises by themselves as having some kind of magical effect, but through prayer, through ascetic practices, we can grow closer to God. Now, the other thing that struck me this morning, reminds me of this, was the troparion. Your illiterate disciples, your Holy Spirit made your illiterate disciples into teachers, O Christ our God. That's right. Jesus did not send them to the seminary, right? He didn't say you have to pass an exit exam and get a degree. Now, again, we want our clergy to be educated. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. But what that hymn shows us is that the heart of the early church and the heart of the Orthodox Church today, the emphasis is on acquiring the Holy Spirit. And that is done in one way, through the purification of the nous. How do we purify our nous? How do we purify our mind? How do we grow closer to God? That's what the church is giving us through these practices. This is what happens when we read the Bible, if we do it in the right way. If we do these things in the right manner, when we receive the sacraments, all of these things contribute. So what the Orthodox Church speaks about is ascent. This is the language of the fathers, that we elevate ourselves our minds up to God. So this is something that does not require education. And in fact, I will tell you, I think sometimes that's a hindrance. So sometimes we think that we'll be a better Christian if we know more. And that's just not the case. Unfortunately, it should be, but we're not Gnostics. We're not saved by our knowledge. We can know all things. And that's what St. Paul said also. I may have all wisdom and understanding, and I may even give my body to be burnt, but if I don't have love, I am nothing. I have nothing. So, again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm an educator. I'm into the Bible. I mean, I think it's helpful. It's important. We should do this. We should learn more about the faith. We should read. But we should always remember that the reason why we do those things is for the purification of our nous, so that we can come closer to God, not to become puffed up like those Corinthians with ourselves. And that's a great danger, especially, I have to say, for the Orthodox. Well, the other people have the problem too, I guess. They do. But to me, because I live in this world, I see people who learn something and then they decide they're going to tell everybody else how to live. What's right, what's wrong, and then they're going to pronounce other people heretics. So I had a kind of interesting day. We have a few minutes. I'll share with you what happened yesterday. As I was traveling here, I started to get messages from people. First of all, I'll start with something else. There was a fellow who had written to me, was conversing with me back and forth, and he felt kind of lost and wasn't sure if he believed in God, and I was talking to him, and well, I don't know where to go, and I don't know what to do, and I said, go to church. Talk to the priest. Well, I don't know what priest to believe, and go to church. Go to church. Find a priest. If there's something wrong with the priest, you'll find out that there's something wrong with the priest. But don't sit home and say, I don't know what to believe. I don't know how to behave. I'm lost. I'm not sure. Go to church. I mean, so much is very, very toxic on the internet. So yesterday as I was traveling, I stopped in Vancouver to change planes, and I got these messages. So-and-so, somebody's talking about you on the internet and saying that you don't believe in the ever virginity of Mary. What can I say? What can I say? So I was rather disappointed because the first person who actually posted that was a priest, an Orthodox priest, with whom I had some, email exchanges some years ago. And of course it starts. And I try not to go on the internet and participate in these things. A couple of people responded, and now I'll just tell you, my point had to do with a specific theological point I was trying to make, all right? And then the priest said, she believes that she's a virgin before and after, but not during. And I say, how is that possible? How is that even possible? That doesn't even make sense. So I started thinking about the things, and of course I've posted, I don't know, there's about 350 podcasts out there. So of course, and some of them I started in 2008, so they're old, and there are some things that I would be more careful about how I express them or explain them. So, this was from the past. We were talking about the virgin birth in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah and whatnot. So I remember saying that there are certain kind of traditions that some people have, that the Lord was born out of the side of the Theotokos. I don't know if you've heard this. And so this is, I wish I hadn't said it now because some of you haven't heard it. But part of it is out of piety, okay? And part of it is, it's not even in the Proto-Evangelium of James, but it kind of hints that there was some kind of super unusual way that Jesus was born. Why? Because we want to preserve her virginity. As if you don't lose your virginity by giving birth, So, but it's a very technical thing. Look at this, it's very technical. Well, if she gives birth in the regular way, then she's not a virgin anymore. I don't agree with that. So I was saying how silly it is to have this notion that if she gave birth to the Lord in the regular way, that she's not a virgin anymore. I said, that's ridiculous. Of course, she doesn't lose her virginity that way. But my point was this, and now there is this kind of tradition, again, out of piety, and that's fine if you want to believe that, but if you don't want to believe that, you're not a heretic. But somebody called me a heretic, okay, on the internet, because of this. Now, that's because the priest said she doesn't believe in the ever virginity of Mary. I wrote to him, I said, Father, you know, you're suggesting that I'm saying that I believe that she had relations. Of course I don't. But this is what happens. Now, I just want to explain to you the reason for this, but this is what happens when we get on the internet and we make these kind of, try to explain things from a theological perspective. Saint Cyril of Alexandria, see if you can follow me on this. This is why I took this particular position, and I explained that, you know, again, if you want to have these pious beliefs, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't, we have in Orthodoxy the freedom not to believe those things. We don't have a hierarchy that says you must believe absolutely every little detail that these whatever people say. Now, even though some fathers say this, okay, Saint Cyril of Alexandria does not say this, and he says that the Lord was born in the usual way, and here's why. Because he had to be like us in every respect, okay? He had to have a human birth. So the church has always insisted upon the fact that the Lord had a perfect humanity, and that also means this. Now, if other fathers say that he was born out of the side to preserve the virginity, that's fine. I'm not contradicting the fathers. I'm just saying that this was what Cyril said, and this is why he said it, and I think that that's important, that we don't try to find sort of technical reasons to support the ever virginity of Mary. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? This desire kind of stems from this insistence that we find some way to save her from any accusation that she wasn't a virgin. And actually, you know where that comes from? That comes from pagan and Jewish people in the early centuries of the church that were attacking the Theotokos, okay? Questioning her virginity. So, of course, anyway. So what I'm trying to tell you is, this is the mind of the world. When we spend our time on the internet, we get involved in these debates, which I think they're absolutely unproductive, they're harmful. People are weighing in with their opinions. She says this, she doesn't say that, she believes, by the way, the first thing, what are the teachings of Dr. Constantinou? I don't have teachings about things. I teach what the church says. Okay, the church says she's ever virgin. That's it. That's enough for us. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to explain how she could give birth and remain a virgin. If the Lord can pass through walls after his resurrection, he can pass through her, he can do whatever he wants. I don't have to explain it. And that, in fact, is part of our Phronema. And that's why I'm shocked to see the kinds of discussions that go on the internet with people trying to prove theological points. So, it's about almost time to take a break, so why don't we stop at this point? I'll let you go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about why be Orthodox and the foundations of our faith, and we will continue with these discussions.
Thank you.